This is the Big O Show. This is the Big O Show.
All right, we promised you we're going to continue honoring Coach Shula, obviously a man that made a major impact in all of our lives, all of us that are Dolphin fans and been following this team for a long, long time. A gentleman that's been covering the Dolphins for a long, long time, dating back to the Shula days with the Dolphin Digest. You can now catch him writing for Dolphins.com. He is Andy Cohen. I have known him for a long, long time. You could follow him on Twitter at @ACohenFins. Andy, how are you doing, my friend? Good
I'm
afternoon.
wonderful. I'm wonderful. It's been a long time, Orlando. Hope you're doing well, buddy.
I am doing great, as good as I can, considering everything going on, and doing this new thing that has actually gone really, really well since we've become an on-demand society. This is the way of the world nowadays, on demand. So it's actually been a blessing in disguise for me to do this. But
good for you.
So you tell me, Andy, what was the first thing that crossed your mind when you heard the news yesterday morning?
It was disbelief initially, because if anybody is impenetrable in my eyes, somebody that you just don't see succumbing to what's next, it's Don Shula. And I know how much he gets slowed down. I saw him this year, and he really was, a shadow of what he once was. But he was still Don Shula, and he still commanded the respect and the love that he always had. So my first reaction was disbelief. And then as the reality hit me, sadness engulfed me. There were so many emotions. Certainly sad, because I was honored to call him a friend. He made me a better journalist. He held me accountable. He tested me as a journalist. And then in the later years, we became friends. And I value that, and something I'll never take for granted. So it went from disbelief to sadness, to admiration and reminiscing about all the things that made him what he was.
And I would imagine that for you, talk to me a little bit about how he held you accountable, because Andy, when I first started covering the Dolphins in the early 90s, which was the end, the last couple of years of Shula's run, I told the fans I didn't ask a question for the first month. I just watched you and everybody else, Armando, whoever, asking questions. I just wanted to see how they approached the man and then how he handled everything. And in that month, I saw some, tension-filled moments with a couple of writers that may have pushed an envelope in a direction he didn't want to. So walk us through an example of how he made you better and how he tested you.
Yeah, you had to earn his respect. It just didn't come. And if he didn't respect you, you may as well forget it. He'll just lambaste you. He'll just jump all over you. But if he respected you, and what I did in my case is I was the beat guy for the Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel, and I used to bring him the newspaper every day because it wasn't easy to get to St. Thomas because it was in Miami. And I wanted to make sure that he, A, knew who I was, and B, read my stuff. So every day I would bring several copies of the Sun-Sentinel and give it to Ann, his secretary. And that was a way for him to at least understand what my work was about. But he tested me several times. He made me back up statements. He made me explain myself. And I think he respected the fact that I didn't back down, that I looked him in the eye, that I told him how I felt, that I showed him respect. But at the same time, I didn't try to be anything that I wasn't. And I think over time, I remember one day it was after a third practice of the day. And as you know, he had some 3 practice days. We're walking off the field, and he put his arm on my shoulder, and he said to me, "Good job, Andy." I wasn't sure what he was talking about, Orlando, but I almost felt that moment was a rite of passage for me. And as time evolved, I mean, I covered until his retirement from 1980 on. So we experienced a lot of things together, and we developed a friendship. We played tennis together. I wrote that in my column. He wouldn't let me lob because you play by Shula's rules or no rules at all. I got to know his family. It's something that I hold with great value, and I will always cherish in my mind.
Did you ever feel guilty when you beat Shula in tennis?
I didn't beat. He wouldn't let me beat him. He wouldn't let me lob. My game was lobbing, and he would come into net all the time. And even 25 years ago, he could move okay, but he couldn't get to my lobs. And at one point, he just turned to me and says, "That's it. No more lobs." And I said, "Oh, okay." And that point, and after that, it was an equalizer. He found the equalizer. So what could I do?
Oh, the coach.
But we didn't
right?
play very much. I think we played 1 or 2 times.
He was the coach even on the tennis court, finding
of course.
the strength and weakness. I gotta love that.
I don't know if you remember his Miami Lakes media golf outings.
Yes.
Right before training camp would begin every year, but he would always fix his team. He would always win.
Yeah.
I mean, Ray Floyd would somehow show up and be on his team. He just didn't like to lose whatever he was doing. Oh,
that is fantastic. So, walk us through covering Shula in those days. Okay, when you've got to cover him after a loss and after a win, walk us through the difference there for you and how you had to handle it.
He was remarkably consistent. Yes, I have never seen him more upset than he was after the snowplow game in the early '80s when that convict on the sideline drove the tractor, cleared a swath of grass to let John Smith kick a field goal that beat the Dolphins 3-0. And I've never seen him angrier. You know why? Because there was nothing more important to him than the integrity of the game. There was nothing more important to him than the NFL shield. And he saw both of those attacked that day. And he was livid. I mean, he was hyperventilating livid so much that day. But then you go back to the scene in 1985 when they beat the Chicago Bears. And to this day, that one game to me was the best coaching job I've ever seen Don Shula do. That one game, because he figured out how to beat a team that supposedly couldn't be beaten. And after that game, the joy. Usually, he would try to disguise, hold back some of the joy, maybe let it out more with his assistants, but not to the media. But the unbridled joy he had that night after beating the Bears, the sense of accomplishment, the proud father look of what Dan Marino did that night, was something I'll never forget. So, yeah, there were definitely two sides of Don Shula, but there was also a lot of consistency game in and game out as well.
Yeah, I think that's what his players appreciated more than anything else, that he wasn't really going to overreact about one thing or another, but when he reacted on something, he was consistent about that. You were going to get the rise out of him, and you knew why you got a rise out of him. He wasn't trying to create any kind of drama or anything along those lines.
But the next day, it's like it never happened. The next day was a new day. So he could rip a writer to shreds in a press conference for asking a question, and the next day it was like it never happened.
Right.
And we all respected him for that because he never really held a grudge. He never kept things last. He never played favorites among the media, except when Edwin Pope came out. He loved Edwin Pope. But for the most part, he was very, very fair to the media.
You know, I'm gonna be the old man on the lawn here. Can you imagine Shula having to deal with today's millennials, either writers or players?
Social media?
Yeah.
Anything you want to know with social media?
Yeah, right. No, but writers or players.
What is this tweet?
Yeah.
Yeah, it would. See, back then, as you know, Orlando, there were about 4 or 5 guys out there every day.
Right.
And that was it.
That was it.
And when you broke into that pack of the guys that were out there every day, you understood that it wasn't the large fraternity that it's evolved to now. It was basically a smallish group of people who were there every day. Joe Zagacki, I remember, was in that group early on in his career. But that was a different time. And today, he was always able to adjust, Orlando. He adjusted with Marino. He adjusted with Zonka and Kick. Could he have adjusted to what the world brings today and the challenges today? It's tough. It's tough. It would have been an interesting thing to see.
Yeah, it would have been a challenge because it's just no, and as if you've dealt with millennials, I mean, you can't rip them and then put your hand on their shoulders an hour later. I mean, they're kind of still smarting from it. They might be smarting from it a year from now. Whereas we kind of grew up in an era where your uncle, your grandfather, your father, either gave you a whack or called you an idiot, and then, 5 minutes later they were hugging you, and it was just like, and you understood that you were an idiot 5 minutes ago, but they still love you, so it's not a big deal. You just got to get over it, and you got over it. In today's world, I don't know if these players and these riders could get over some of these things that happen from one moment to another. I think, think about this. I think about myself. I grew up in this business with guys like Hank Goldberg and Neil Rogers, dude. I mean, no, there's no way people growing up in this business now could deal with guys like Hank and Neil. I mean, Hank would rip me for one moment, but then the first guy that came to my defense to help me with anything was always Hank. Every single – I always tell people that because, sometimes me and Hank had some stuff on the air and we had some fun with it and we went back and forth and he would rip me or whatever, and that's fine. But then behind the scenes, he was the biggest mensch in the world, dude. It was just
100%.
And I would tell people that, and they were like, really? And I go, yeah, what you got on the air wasn't really the Hank you got behind the scenes. The Hank behind the scenes was a whole different dude that you don't get to know at all because he doesn't want you to know that guy. You know what I mean?
In fact, Orlando, segueing back to Shula and Hank, one of the last times I spent some quality time with Shula was at Gulfstream Park. Hank had Shula, Greasy, couple of friends of Shula's, and me out for lunch. And we had the time of our life, and Hank was just beaming every minute of the time because he was always so happy to be around Shula and loved Shula. But really, that was the last time I spent some real quality time with Shula, and it was great. It was great, and it was set up. It was set up by Hank. Interestingly enough,
I've said this a couple times to a couple of other guests here in the last 2 days. I wish Shoes would have hung on just a couple of more years. Yeah. Because I actually think they finally have the right people in place to turn this damn thing around. And it's been a frustrating 20 years. And unfortunately, we've watched them tear down everything that Shula built. But I actually
we criticized him. He was criticized when he went 11-5.
I know.
Oh, we need somebody better than 11. What this franchise would give for an 11-5 right now.
I know. I told the listeners that we got spoiled to the point that 10 wins wasn't enough anymore. You know what I mean? And it was just like so ridiculous. That's why I've always said, and it went on the last couple of years. Oh, no, Riley's past his time. And every time somebody would tell me that, I say, I'm not doing that. I did that with Shula, and I screwed up. And, we won Jimmy, and it never worked out. Jimmy, Saban, Parcells, none of that worked out. We should have stayed with Shula. Well, guess what? Look at Riley. He's finally getting them out of that rut with those bad contracts. Now we see these young guys and Jimmy Butler, and you see, it's kind of what we had to do with with Shula back in those days, and we didn't, and we screwed up. And I learned my lesson at that time, and that's why I have never been one of those guys that wants to ever get rid of Riley. I'm like, Riley will write his ticket. Whenever the heck he wants to walk out the door, I'm good.
On his terms.
Yes, I'm good, which is what we should have done with Shula. We should have let him walk out on his terms. But my point is, I think Greer and Flores get it. I think they're actually doing what football people really do in building a football team for once. And I actually
I agree. It's just a shame we had to wait 20 years for this. But I agree.
And that's where I wish Shula would have stuck around a couple more years to see this thing that it's about to get turned around. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Andy Cohen, of course, from MiamiDolphins.com and Dolphins Digest. So, I was talking about that. The Dolphins Digest was like a Bible for us. You know what I mean?
In the late 90s, we had 40,000 subscribers in 17 different countries. I'm sorry. Every state, 17 countries, 40,000 subscribers. That was before the internet.
Yeah.
And when the internet came along, it changed all the rules of publishing, as you know.
I know. It was just one of those things, man, and it just it was a staple for us as Dolph fans. You know what I mean? Kind of like it was buying the Miami News and the Miami Herald back in when I was a kid. You know what I mean? I mean, that was just the thing that you had to do. When you think about your favorite Shula moment as a reporter, what is it?
Late July, 1983. I'm standing. The media was allowed on the practice field back then. I'm standing 10 feet from Shula when number 13 comes on the practice field for the first time, and I'm standing there, and we see Marino pass after pass, just zipping the ball, unlike any quarterback any of us had seen in person before. And I will never forget the expression on Shula's face. It was like a father who had discovered his long-lost son. He had a grin on his face, Orlando, and just shaking his head back and forth, because at that moment, I believe he knew what Marino was going to be. And really, that's the expression on his face that will always be frozen in time in my mind.
Yeah, there's no doubt, because the second we saw him come off the bench in Oakland against Oakland, it was over from there on out, and that guy left a lasting impression. And you know, for you covered the early '80s, the adjustment he went from Greasy to Woodstock to then Marino. You know, that in itself, to win with all kinds of different quarterbacks and different offenses. I mean, that really, I think, while the early 70s are going to be the ultimate stamp of why he was great because of the championships and the perfect season, some of his best coaching was during that entire stretch, from coaching the Scabs to adjusting in that season, those multiple quarterbacks from.
Oh, yeah, 1982 Orlando is a great example of that, because he had Strock and Woodley. He did something undefinable. I mean, he didn't go with a running game or a passing game. He made do with what he had by having a two-headed quarterback. That was an incredible coaching job that year.
Yeah. No, and I remember even the replacement players were like the least penalized team out of that group and all of that.
Correct.
I mean, it was just one of those things that he made you marvel as a fan. That whoever and that's why Bum Phillips used that famous line.
100%. I was just thinking about that, Orlando. You're 100% right.
You know, it's just one of those things that as a fan, it just reminded you all the time on how great this man was, because he understood what he had, and he didn't force the square peg into the round hole, ever.
No doubt about it. I'll never forget Dan Marino's first game he ever started in the Orange Bowl. They lost to the Buffalo Bills. Joe Ferguson had a great game to the Bills in overtime. They lost 34-31. And in the Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel, the next day, my lead sentence was, the Dolphins lost the game and Don Shula was smiling because he knew what he had in Marino. Because Marino threw for 360 yards and 4 touchdowns. And the bigger picture, for one rare day that day, the bigger picture was more important than the individual picture of that game. And the bigger picture was that he found the quarterback.
Yeah. And who knows? Do you think we found another one finally?
Boy, you know, it's early to tell, but this is the first time that someone's coming with a pedigree like Marino, since Marino, actually.
Yeah.
And he has a chance to be special. He's got it, Orlando.
Yes,
He's got it. And if he can just stay healthy, you know, he's got a chance to be a special player for a long time.
Isn't that funny? Because we're not. It's not a guy that needs to learn how to play the game. It's not a guy that needs to learn how to throw a touch pass. He
knows all that.
It's a guy that just needs to stay healthy. That you know he can do everything else because he's shown it to you. And you know, we've had issues with all kinds of guys with accuracy and ball placement. This guy excels at all of that, which is a trait that is so important in this league, because it's such a fast league. It's a receiving league, and your quarterback must be deadly accurate, must put the ball in the right place to keep the guys flowing. and not stop them. And this guy has all of those things. And it's
I'd like to see Shula in his prime coaching Tua.
Yeah. Yeah. That would be a lot of fun.
He'd have fun with that.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Does he play this year? Because I keep telling people I don't think he plays unless they're mathematically eliminated from the playoffs, and that offensive line is playing really, really well. And obviously, they've got to feel like he's completely 100% healthy and ready to take a hit. But I kind of feel like those three have to be in place before you put him out there. You agree?
Well, the other factor is you have a 38-year-old starting quarterback who has not been injured in a long time.
Right.
And there are those who think, what happens if he goes down? And if he goes down, everything changes because Tua will clearly be next in line. So if injuries become a factor, that could change the whole timetable. But I think under the ideal scenario, I think he watches the first 3 months of the season and then starts the last month of the season. That's what I think.
What was the moment that was the most uncomfortable for you in covering Shula?
Oh, wow.
Was it 95?
Yeah, anything that tarnished the integrity of the game. When he brought in a player, he brought in a running back, Chuck Muncie, for training camp one year, and he was trouble from day one. But Shula really needed a running back, and it took Shula about a week to realize that Muncie was not what he wanted at the time. And he was really, really mad at that point because he had difficulty understanding how a player with talent couldn't just give everything he had and devote his body, soul, and mind to it. And when he found players who didn't, it really, really disgusted him. It really did. And there were drug issues with Muncie. I remember that. And he was here for a while, not a long while, but it really, really angered Shula because of the integrity of the game and how high and how important that was to him.
The Oglesby situation, when he said he got either kidnapped or taken by Martians or whatever.
He laughed about that a lot too, in retrospect. But he breaking rules. He just abhorred players that broke rules, especially his rules. He was an interesting diversion of a man because he went to mass every morning. He was deeply religious, and then he would come out and coach such a violent game and do it in a mannerism where he intimidated, he challenged, he threw so many things at the table for a player. The enormity of playing for Shula was certainly there, and those who got through it and excelled, love him so much today.
Andy, before I let you go, we're going to have Tom Garfinkel on at 2:15, and I'm going to ask him about this. But your thoughts on this? We're not going to be able to give him a proper celebration at the stadium this year because of COVID. So I'm wondering, are we going to do it in parts? Because we won't be able to do it till maybe next offseason or next year that we'll be able to pack the state. Like what we did for Marino, we've got to do for Shula. The same thing we did for Marino, we've got to do for Shula, but we won't be able to do it this year. So how do we do it? Is it going to be in parts that maybe we do some kind of a TV-like celebration the first go-around, and then next offseason or next year we all get together at the stadium to do a real Shula thing?
Yeah, I thought about this shortly after I learned of his death, that what a shame that he will not be honored in the public light. If you left this funeral, they would never do this, but if you left the funeral open to the public, there'd be 40,000 people there. It'd be incredible. And I envisioned in a non-virus world them certainly having a celebration for Shula at the stadium, whether it was tied into a game, whether it was just for that, which I think would also draw very well. But yeah, everything has to be on hold. I think they need to try to take advantage of the world we're in now and maybe have a virtual celebration where, I don't know, can you get hundreds, thousands of people on a virtual celebration? I don't know how it works. I don't know the extreme of something like Zoom, and what it could do. But if you can't, I know his funeral, there'll probably be 8 or 10 people there, his kids.
Right.
It's a shame. It really is a shame because he deserved much more than he's going to be able to get because of this. And I believe something will happen, and I think it will be wonderful, but I think we're going to have to wait.
Yeah, this COVID thing has changed everything in our world. Of course, you can follow him on Twitter like I and so many others do at @CohenFins and catch his work at MiamiDolphins.com. He is the great Andy Cohen. Andy, you are a stud, my man. Thank you for taking some time on this very special week honoring the greatest of all time there, Don Shula. Thank you, sir.
Oh, always a pleasure, and you stay well.
Thank you, my friend. You be good.
Okay.
There you
Bye.
go.